buddy Cut Class says he practices his scratching when he's waiting for his cooking, and I think that's a great example of this in action. For instance, nothing too hard because you'll get frustrated, but also nothing too easy or you'll get bored. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Sai, and today we're talking about 8 scratching tips I wish I knew earlier. Rather than focusing on what you shouldn't do, I thought I'd flip it upside down and we can focus on the things that you should be doing. So no more messing around, let's get to it. It's pretty cold right now, it's winter, and scratching can be pretty repetitive if you hadn't noticed. I personally have suffered from tendonitis the last few years, and it's not so bad right now because I'm not rock climbing regularly, which is my other hobby. But in the past couple of years, it's meant I've not really been able to scratch as much as I'd like. When I do so, my tendons tend to flare up and it's kind of uncomfortable and it's not good, essentially. So I'm not saying you need to do 100 star jumps or anything before you cut, but it might be a good idea to stretch out your fingers, arms and shoulders a bit before you start trying to bosh out those triple click, flare, orbit, boomer barns. And yes, I made that up. Although it sounds good actually. Maybe we should turn that into a scratch. Focusing on record control. So I kind of mentioned this in the last video, link in the description, but I personally really start to notice my cuts becoming on point once my record hand is warmed up. So it makes perfect sense to spend a bit of time every practice session focusing just on your record control. Do lots of tears, drags, and practice pitching all of the scratches you know, going from slow to fast and then back again. Practice effectively. So what the heck am I talking about here? I basically got this from this TED video, which I'll put in the description again. After this video finishes, go check it out. But I've done a lot of reading about this and there's lots of different factors, but one aspect of it is that you want to be practicing within the Goldilocks zone. So for instance, nothing too hard because you'll get frustrated, but also nothing too easy or you'll get bored. The bit in the middle where you're pushing your boundaries but not getting frustrated is the Goldilocks zone. According to the TED video, good practice is also consistent, intensely focused, and targets weaknesses that lie at the edge of one's abilities. Unfortunately, freestyling all day probably isn't the best use of your time. Practice regularly. Apparently, it's better to practice 5 minutes a day than it is one long hour session a week, and I have to agree. There's a really good book about all of this stuff called Atomic Habits. It's basically based on the notion that what we achieve in life is all based around our daily habits. We need to do everything in our power to trick our future selves to make the things we want into good habits. Our brain is essentially quite lazy and it's always pushing against new things, even if they're good for us. A good example of this might be setting your turntables up in an accessible place so you jump on them more often. My buddy Cut Class says he practices his scratching when he's waiting for his cooking, and I think that's a great example of this in action. Another example of this is committing to practice 5 minutes a day. 5 minutes a day is quite a low investment and you're much more likely to do that than if you say you're going to practice for an hour. And you never know, those 5 minutes might turn into 60 minutes anyway, but essentially you're going to be building the habit and that's what's important. Speaking of habits, recording yourself regularly is a really good one to get into. Not only will it give you a good idea of how good you really are in reality versus how good you sound in your head, but it will also be great to look back in the future and see how much you've really improved over time. It's also probably the closest thing you can get to performing in front of other people without actually having to perform in front of other people. The more you record, the sooner you can get over the dreaded red button syndrome, and yes, we all suffer from it at the start.
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
I made a cheeky video on how you can record a performance you can be proud of up here, and also I'll link it in the description, so check that out if you fancy it. There's this thing in art called the gap, which is essentially the distance between your current abilities and your taste. If you're going to spend all these hours trying to close this gap, it's really a good idea to make sure that your taste is good, because there's no point practicing all this stuff if you're essentially going in the wrong direction than you want to. With scratching, it can often be hard to find the stuff that you really want to be learning towards and aiming towards. For instance, Q-bert is absolutely incredible, but he's so advanced that it can be really disheartening or essentially just useless trying to even break down what he's doing to a beginner. So what alternatives do we have? One thing you could try is watching older DMC videos or listening to scratching in older hip hop tracks. These can be a great inspiration on how to use the fundamental scratches in more funky ways. There's a good channel with all of the old DMCs uploaded to it, and also a Beat Junkies podcast where they talk about their old favorite tracks, and I'll put the links to those in the description, and it might be worth checking those out and seeing if you can learn some of those older techniques, but in a really like cool way, because learning those techniques and learning them in a cool way is often different. If you can, it's even better to scratch with others. Questioning and answering with a buddy is a great way to get new ideas for patterns and to stay motivated. Right now, I know that's difficult, and I know when I first started scratching, no one within like a 50-mile radius even knew what a flare was. If that's the case for you, it's fine. We live in the internet age, and there's a great community over on TinyChat where you can go and see other scratch DJs, and they go on there every night and they go bust out their like moves, and you can go and join in essentially. I'll put the link in the description. It's a really cool community. The last tip is to enter a battle. And I have to admit, this one is a little bit more of do as I say than do as I do, because I'm not much of a battler myself. However, I have entered a couple of smaller scratch battles, and I always came out feeling pretty motivated, essentially. There's something about competing that gets your blood going, and it's really exciting. And if you know you've got a battle coming up, it's going to give you that extra kick up the arse to go and jump on your decks and practice. I'm sure you've seen this yourself, but the DJs who always seem to get the best the fastest are the ones who battle. Plus, it's a really good way to make a name for yourself and get a little bit of street cred. So those are my tips. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and here's some more videos about scratching. Peas and carrots, y'all.